The ring hit the floorboards of Hector Crane's general store and spun in a lazy, mocking circle before it fell flat. And every soul in Dusty Creek, Texas froze as if the hand of God had pressed down on the room. Maggie Mercer stood with her chin lifted and her dark eyes burning, the rejected gold band still rolling at her feet, and the man who had just offered it, Deputy Marshal Silas Prout, stood 6 feet tall and red-faced and trembling with a fury he was barely keeping caged behind his teeth. "You are making a fool of me," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous in the way that storms are low and dangerous before they break everything open. "I am making an honest woman of myself," Maggie said back, and her voice did not waver once. "There is a difference." The dozen or so people crowded into the store, picking up their flour and their tobacco and their lengths of calico, had gone perfectly still. Old Dottie Marsh clutched her basket to her chest. The Hendricks boys, 17 and too young to understand what they were witnessing but old enough to sense danger, pressed themselves against the pickle barrel. Hector Crane himself, a man who had seen 2 gunfights and a flash flood and come through both with the same mild expression, watched from behind his counter with something approaching awe. This was the 3rd proposal Maggie Mercer had refused in as many months. Silas Prout bent and snatched the ring from the floor, and the movement was rough and wounded, the way a man moves when he is trying to hide that something inside him has cracked. He straightened and looked at her with his jaw working. "Every man in this county knows you're looking for a husband," he said. "Your father's land won't run itself. You got no brothers left, no kin to speak of. You turned down Tom Aldridge, you turned down Warren Bliss, now you turn me down. What exactly are you waiting for, Maggie Mercer? A king." The store was so quiet that the sound of a horse shifting its weight outside on the hitching post was perfectly audible. The sound of the wind threading through the gap under the door was perfectly audible, and the sound of a single set of boots, unhurried and unhurrying, moving from the back of the store toward the front was perfectly audible. Abel Walker set his sack of oats on the counter without looking at either of them. He was not a particularly large man, and he was not a particularly small one. He had shoulders that spoke of years of actual labor rather than the performed kind, and hands that were darkened and calloused in the specific way of a man who works cattle and land every single day without exception. He had a face that was pleasant without being remarkable, brown hair that needed cutting, and gray eyes that were, in this moment, looking at nothing in particular while he counted out coins for Hector Crane. He was, as far as the citizens of Dusty Creek were concerned, the quietest man in the county. He had run the Walker Ranch on the eastern edge of town for 3 years, since his father passed, and in 3 years he had participated in approximately no gossip, no arguments, no drunken evenings at the saloon, and no social climbing of any variety. He existed at the gentle edge of things, and people found this either comforting or suspicious depending on their nature. He had not looked at Maggie Mercer once since she walked through that door 14 months ago, newly returned from the women's seminary in San Antonio to find her father ailing and her prospects, according to every voice in town, narrowing by the season. He did not look at her now. But as he picked up his oats and turned for the door, he paused, not dramatically, not in the way of a man who has been waiting for his moment. He paused the way a person pauses when they have thought of something that seems to them simply worth saying. "Pardon me," he said, and his voice was quiet and level, addressed to no one and both of them. "But it seems to me, if a woman keeps saying no, the question worth asking isn't why she won't say yes. It's whether anybody's bothered to ask her what she actually wants." And then he walked out. The door swung shut behind him. The bell above it gave one small, clear ring. Silas Prout looked at the door. He looked at Maggie. Then he put his hat back on his head and walked out after Abel Walker, though in the opposite direction entirely, and the sound of his horse leaving at a trot was sharp and hard on the afternoon air. The store exhaled. Dottie Marsh was the first to speak, because Dottie Marsh was always the first to speak. "Well," she said, "I'll be." Maggie Mercer stood where she had been standing, and she was looking at the door that Abel Walker had gone through, and the expression on her face was not the one anyone in Dusty Creek would have predicted. It was not relief, and it was not triumph, and it was not the polished, resolved dignity she usually wore when she said no to men. It was something more unguarded than all of those things. It was the expression of a person who has just heard something they did not know they were waiting to hear. She thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. To understand why Maggie Mercer kept saying no, you had to understand the summer of 1879, and specifically the summer of 1879 in Calhoun County, Texas, and even more specifically, you had to understand what it meant to be Elias Mercer's daughter at the age of 26, with 140 acres of land that everyone in the county wanted a piece of, and a father who had spent the last 2 years fading slowly away in the back bedroom of the house he had built with his own hands. Elias Mercer had been a hard man and an honest one, and the combination of those qualities had made him both respected and not particularly loved. He had come to Texas from Georgia after the war with nothing but debt and determination, and he had turned both into something real. He had married a woman named Clara, who was warm where he was hard, and she had died of fever when Maggie was 11, and Elias had loved her so completely that he had never once considered replacing her, which meant that Maggie grew up understanding, at a bone-deep level, that love was not a transaction. It was not a strategy. It was not a negotiation. Her brother James had died at 22, thrown from a horse, and after that it had been just Maggie and her father and the land and the cattle and the slow, grinding work of keeping something alive that wants to die. When Elias' health began to fail, the proposals started arriving with the regularity of rainfall. Tom Aldridge, who was 42 and had already buried one wife and was perfectly pleasant about it, had come calling with his hat in his hands and a reasonable offer on the table. He had told Maggie he admired her industry and her spirit and her land, in approximately that order. Maggie had thanked him for his time and declined. Warren Bliss, who was 35 and ran the lumber operation east of the creek, had been more direct. He told her that a woman in her position needed a man in his position, and that together they would be a force in the county. Maggie had found this framing, the position-to-position argument, to be among the least romantic things she had ever heard, and she had told him with great courtesy that she would have to decline. And then Silas Prout, who was handsome and confident and accustomed to getting what he wanted through the combination of those qualities, had chosen a public stage for his proposal in the way that men who are used to public stages always do. He had wanted to make it impossible for her to say no by surrounding the question with witnesses. He had misunderstood Maggie Mercer completely. The dark past she carried was not complicated, not exactly. It was simply the truth of what she had watched, a woman who was loved absolutely, losing herself in that love absolutely, and then leaving a gap in the world that nothing could fill. Her mother's death had not warned her away from love. Her father's grief had. The grief was so total, so consuming, so unasked for. Elias Mercer had not wanted to lose himself in love. He had simply done it anyway, and when Clara died, what was left of him was a man-shaped shell that worked and breathed and made decisions but was not quite there. Maggie had sworn, at 11, and again at 16, and again at 21, that she would not give herself away like that. She would not hand the center of herself to someone and then have to live without it. What she had not yet worked out, in any of her careful thinking on the subject, was the difference between loving someone and giving yourself away. She did not yet understand that those were not necessarily the same thing. She had not yet met anyone who made her want to figure out that distinction. Abel Walker's ranch sat on flat eastern land, where the grass was the color of honey in September, and the sky came down close and personal without any hills to interrupt it. He had 43 head of cattle, a working windmill, a house that was modest and clean, a barn that was considerably better constructed than the house, and a dog named Hector who was not named after Hector Crane but Hector of Troy, which told you something about Abel Walker that most people in Dusty Creek had never had occasion to learn. He had grown up on this land. His mother, Ruth, had died when he was 19, his father, William, when he was 23, and he had been alone on the ranch for 3 years. Not lonely, exactly. Alone. He understood the difference and had made a kind of peace with it, the way a person who has learned to set a broken bone themselves stops being particularly frightened of broken bones. He did not go to social events because he found them exhausting in a way he couldn't always justify. He was not unsociable. He liked people well enough, in the specific and individual way of someone who is more comfortable with one conversation than with 27 conversations happening simultaneously. He knew the name of every family in Dusty Creek. He brought medicine out to the Navarro family when their youngest had whooping cough and didn't mention it to anyone. He fixed the fence along the southern edge of Mrs. Ellison's property because it was falling into the road, and she was 73, and he was passing anyway. He had seen Maggie Mercer from a distance for 14 months, and he had not said one word to her directly, not because he was uninterested, but because he was deeply, privately aware that she was surrounded by people who wanted things from her, and he did not want to be another one of those people. He had not yet figured out what he wanted to say. What came out in Hector Crane's store that September afternoon had not been planned. It had simply arrived, the way true things sometimes arrive, fully formed and without warning, and he had said it before he quite knew he was going to. He thought about it the whole ride home, which was 11 miles of flat grass and cooling autumn air, and what he mostly thought was that he had probably just embarrassed himself, and that Maggie Mercer would find the whole thing presumptuous at best. He was not a deputy marshal. He was not a lumber magnate. He was not a man with particular standing or visible ambition. He was a rancher with 43 cows and a dog named after a Trojan hero, and a tendency to think more than he spoke. He fed Hector his dinner and went inside and made himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table and read from his battered copy of Marcus Aurelius for a while, and then he went to bed. He did not expect to see Maggie Mercer again before the next time he needed to go to town for supplies, which would be 3 weeks out, probably, unless the weather changed. She came to his ranch 2 days later. He was in the corral working with a young horse, a roan mare that had come to him half wild and was taking her time deciding whether he was trustworthy, when he heard the wheels of a wagon on the track that led up from the road. He let the mare settle, stepped out of the corral, and shaded his eyes. Maggie Mercer was driving a 2-horse wagon with the easy competence of a woman who has been doing it since she was old enough to hold reins. She was wearing a practical brown dress and a hat against the sun, and she brought the wagon to a stop about 20 feet from him and looked down at him with an expression that was direct without being aggressive. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Miss Mercer," he said. There was a pause that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable either. It occupied some middle territory that neither of them seemed in a hurry to resolve. "I came to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "What you said in the store." She looked at him steadily. "Did you mean it, about asking what I actually want?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said, "I meant it." Another pause. She looked at the corral, at the roan mare who had come to the fence and was watching their exchange with large, liquid eyes. Then she looked back at him. "Nobody has ever actually asked me that," she said, "in the specific words." "I know," he said. "I've watched people not ask you for over a year." Something moved across her face at that, something quick and difficult to name. "You've been watching, noticing," he said, with a slight correction that wasn't quite defensive. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she did something he was not expecting. She laughed. It was a short laugh, startled out of her rather than performed, and it changed her face entirely, pulled something tight loose in it. "All right," she said. "There's a difference." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for him to offer a hand, which he had been about to do, and she stood on the ground and looked at him levelly. She was not a small woman. She was not a particularly tall one either, but she stood with the kind of straight-spined certainty that made her seem exactly the right size for whatever room or field she occupied. "So ask me," she said. He blinked. "Now." "You're the one who said it," she pointed out. He was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat the way men did when they were thinking and turned it by the brim slowly. Then he put it back on. "What do you actually want, Miss Mercer?" he said. "Not out of a husband, out of your life. What do you actually want?" The question landed and she stood in it for a moment. She had been preparing for this, she realized, for the whole 2-day ride over here in her mind. And she still wasn't quite ready for it. The exact specificity of it. The way it didn't offer her a list of his qualifications, or a list of her advantages, or anything at all about position or practicality. "I want to keep my father's land," she said finally. "Not just keep it, make something real of it. He started with nothing and he built something worth building. I don't want to sell it off or let it go to seed because everyone assumes a woman can't run 140 acres. I want to run it properly, better than properly." She had said this much to herself in the dark. But she kept going because the question was still open and he was still listening in the particular way he had, without interjecting, without nodding too enthusiastically, just genuinely receiving what she was saying. "I want to choose," she said. "I want to choose the person, not be chosen. Not be selected because my land is convenient and my father is dying and I'm the only thing standing between a family legacy and a courthouse auction. I want to do the choosing." She stopped. Her voice had gone somewhat fiercer than she had intended. "I'm sorry. That wasn't— don't apologize for that," he said. She closed her mouth. "That's the clearest thing I've heard anyone say in about 2 years," he said. "You don't need to apologize for it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The roan mare snorted at the fence. "Why did you say it?" she asked. "In the store. You've never said anything to me before. You've never said anything to anyone, particularly from what I can tell." He thought about it. The honesty of the question deserved an honest answer. "Because Prout was asking the wrong question," he said. "He was asking why you kept saying no and treating your no like a malfunction, like something to be fixed. And I found that." He paused, searching for the right word. "Irritating," he finally settled on. "I found it irritating. On my behalf. On behalf of the question mostly," he said. "It seemed like the right question was obvious and nobody was asking it." "And now you've asked it," she said. "Now I've asked it," he agreed. She looked back at the road she had come in on and then back at him. "I should tell you," she said, "that I didn't come here because I'm looking for a husband. I came here because you said something intelligent and I wanted to know whether you were actually intelligent or whether it was an accident." He smiled. It was a slow smile, arriving at its destination without hurry. "What's the verdict?" "Still deciding," she said, and climbed back up onto the wagon. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." "Good afternoon, Miss Mercer." She turned the wagon on the flat ground with the efficiency of long practice and drove back down the track toward the road, and he stood watching until she was out of sight, and Hector the dog came and sat on his foot, which was what Hector did when he sensed that something significant was happening that he couldn't quite parse. "I know," Abel said to the dog. "Me neither." Over the next 3 weeks, an unusual thing began to happen in Dusty Creek. The thing that began to happen was that Maggie Mercer and Abel Walker kept ending up in the same places at approximately the same times, which in a town of 400 people was not statistically remarkable, and yet both of them felt it to be remarkable, because neither of them was engineering it, and yet it kept occurring. She was at the well when he came to fill his canteens. He was at the farrier's when she brought in one of her father's horses with a loose shoe. She arrived at the feed store the same Tuesday morning that he arrived, and they stood side by side looking at the posted prices for grain while Hector Crane's assistant, a boy named Pike who was 17 and observant, watched them with great interest. Each time they talked. Not at length, not dramatically, but in the way of people who have discovered that conversation with each other costs them less energy than conversation with almost anyone else, which is a rare thing, and both of them knew it, even if they weren't ready to say it out loud. He told her about the roan mare, whose name turned out to be Clementine, because she had arrived on the day he'd been humming that song, and it seemed to stick. She told him about the northeastern field of her father's land that had been losing water for 2 seasons and what she thought the problem was. He had a theory about that. They talked about the theory for 20 minutes at the edge of the road, in the cooling afternoon light, and when they parted ways, both of them were thinking about the other, and both of them were pretending, for the moment, not to be. Her father Elias had one of his better weeks in October, which meant he was up and sitting by the window in the afternoon and asking questions again. He was 71 and had the chest condition the doctor in San Antonio called emphysema, and it was taking him slowly, and there was nothing to be done about it except make him comfortable and keep the ranch running so that what he had built would still be there when he was gone. Maggie sat with him on a Tuesday afternoon, mending tack by the window while the light came in golden and slant, and Elias said, without preamble, in the way of very old men who have decided they are too tired for preamble, "You're thinking about someone." Maggie kept her eyes on the leather in her hands. "I think about a great many things." "Not like this," Elias said. "You've got the same look your mother had when she was trying to talk herself out of something she'd already decided." She looked up at that. Elias was watching her with his old, sharp eyes that had not been softened by illness in the slightest. "I'm not talking myself out of anything," she said. "That's the problem, I think," Elias said mildly. "Who is it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Abel Walker. The quiet one, Walker's boy. He's not a boy, he's 28. "I know how old he is," Elias said. "I knew his father, good man, better than he knew how to show." He looked out the window at the yellowing field. "What's the obstacle? I didn't raise a woman who gets stopped by obstacles." "There's no obstacle," Maggie said. "There's nothing, there's just—" She stopped. "He hasn't proposed to me, father, he's just— we talk." Elias made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was cousin to one. "Talking," he said, "with a man for 3 weeks." "Yes. And how's that going?" She looked at the leather again. "Better than any proposal I've had," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. Elias turned back to the window. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke, it was to the field, not to her. "Your mother and I," he said. "We talked for 3 months before anything else. Everybody thought I was too slow about it. She used to say those 3 months were the thing that made the rest of it possible, that we knew each other, really knew each other before we made any promises." He paused. "I've been a hard man, I know that. I've been harder than I needed to be some days. But the thing I got right was her. And the way I got that right was by listening more than I talked." Maggie looked at her father's profile against the afternoon light. "Invite him to supper," Elias said. Abel Walker came to supper on a Friday evening in late October, and he brought a jar of wild honey he had found on the eastern edge of his property, because he had been raised to not arrive at someone's home without something in his hands, and also because he thought Maggie might appreciate the practical offering more than flowers, which, as it turned out, was exactly right. Maggie Mercer received him in the front room with the formal courtesy of a man who had made up his mind to form an opinion based on evidence rather than reputation. He asked Abel about his cattle operation with the sharpness of a man who knew cattle and could tell immediately whether the answers were honest. Abel answered honestly, including the parts that reflected poorly on his current season, the calf losses he'd had in spring, the water issue on the north pasture, the decision he'd made about stock that had cost him more than he'd expected. Elias listened to all of it and then said, "You don't oversell yourself." "Doesn't do much good," Abel said. "The land knows what you've done and haven't done, makes a liar out of you pretty quick." Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and Maggie, who was in the kitchen doorway listening, felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Over supper, which was venison stew and cornbread, and the kind of strong coffee that the Texas frontier had standardized into near-universal habit, Abel and Elias talked about water rights, which were a burning issue in the county in 1879, and about the railroad routes that everyone knew were coming through eventually, and about a cattle disease that had swept through the panhandle 2 seasons back, and whether it was moving south. Maggie contributed to all 3 topics with opinions that were well-reasoned and specific, and Abel listened to her with the same attention he gave to anything else he was actually interested in, which was, Maggie noticed, different from the way most men listen to women talking about cattle, which was the attentive but waiting for it to stop kind of listening. He listened as though what she said might change his thinking, because it did. After Elias tired and retired to his room, Maggie and Abel sat on the front porch in the dark with the second round of coffee and the jar of honey between them and the absolutely enormous Texas sky overhead, brilliant and cold with stars. And for a while they just sat with it, the silence and the stars and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. "Your father's a good man," Abel said finally. "He's a hard man," Maggie said. "But yes." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Abel said. She looked at him. He was looking at the stars. "What was yours like?" she asked. "Similar," he said, "except quieter. My father thought silence was a virtue nearly equal to honesty. He talked to animals more than people. I inherited the tendency." He paused. "My mother was the one who kept us connected to the world. She knew everybody's name, everybody's trouble. When she died, we lost that." "Is that why you're so quiet in town?" He looked at the stars a moment longer. "Partly. And partly I never developed the habit of talking without something to say." He glanced at her. "I've noticed I seem to have more to say lately." She was quiet for a moment. The stars burned. Something in her chest was doing something she didn't entirely trust yet but was not willing to stop. "I've been thinking about what you asked me," she said. "About what I want. You gave me an answer." "I gave you part of one," she said. "The practical part, the land and the choices and all of that." He turned on the bench to look at her properly, giving her his full attention without demand. "The other part," she said, "is harder to say, because it's the part I've been afraid of." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "I watched my father love my mother so completely that when she died there wasn't enough of him left to raise us well. He tried. He did try, but the grief took something essential. And I swore to myself that I would never—" She stopped, started again. "I swore I would never let another person be that necessary to me, that I would stay whole whatever happened." Abel was very still. "Every man who has come courting me," she said, "has come wanting something I have. The land, the status, the idea of me. None of them have made me feel anything except careful, like I needed to protect something." She looked at him. "But talking to you feels the opposite of that." He did not immediately speak. He sat with what she had said in the way of a man who knows that some things deserve to be sat with before they are responded to. "I think," he said finally, "that what happened to your father wasn't a consequence of loving your mother too much. I think it was a consequence of not having built enough of himself that was separate from her. That's a real risk. It's a real thing, but I don't think the solution is to not love anyone." He paused. "I think the solution is to know who you are well enough that love adds to you instead of replacing you." She looked at him. "That might be easy for me to say," he acknowledged. "I haven't been tested like that." "No," she said. "It doesn't sound easy. It sounds like something you've actually thought about." "I've had a lot of quiet evenings," he said, with a slight smile that the darkness made more gentle than it might otherwise have been. Maggie looked back at the stars. Something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you can feel the weather change before the evidence is visible. Something had moved from one place to another, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not afraid of it. "I'm not ready to call this anything," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "That's clear," he said, "but I'd like to keep talking." "I'd like that too," he said. They sat on the porch for another hour and talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are building something between them out of ordinary words and they both know it, and neither of them is willing to rush it. November arrived cold and dry, the way Texas Novembers often did, with a wind out of the north that made the cattle restless and the firewood valuable. Abel Walker brought a wagon of split wood out to the Mercer ranch on a Saturday morning, because he had cut more than he needed, and because Maggie had mentioned, in passing, that one of her hired hands had left in October and she was short on help. He spent the morning stacking it in the woodshed without being asked to, working alongside Maggie's remaining hand, a quiet Tejano man named Ernesto Vila, who had been with the Mercer family for 8 years, and who watched Abel Walker with the careful assessment of a man who loves the family he works for, and is measuring whether this stranger is what he appears to be. By noon, Ernesto had given Abel the specific nod that meant provisional acceptance, which Maggie later told Abel was more than he gave most people in a year. Abel stayed for lunch, and then he and Maggie walked the northern field that was losing water, because he had been thinking about it since she first mentioned it. He crouched at the low end of the field and looked at the soil and the gradient, and the way the grass was thinning in the specific pattern that told a story if you knew how to read it. He asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3 with precision. He asked a 4th. She thought about it and said she didn't know, and he said he wasn't sure either, but he had an idea, and they talked through the idea standing in the cold November wind while Ernesto watched from the fence line with an expression of careful, slowly warming approval. The idea worked. It took them 3 weeks of intermittent labor, digging a redirect channel to improve drainage and stop the slow underground pooling that was drowning the grass roots from below. But when they were done, the field was draining as it should, and Maggie stood at the edge of it in the weak December sun and looked at what they had accomplished together and felt something that was new and complicated and very good. "Thank you," she said. "You would have figured it out," he said. "Probably," she agreed, "but it would have taken me longer alone." He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had spent months learning to read and said, simply, "That's sort of the point, isn't it?" She looked at him. The December light was thin and clear, and it found every honest line of his face, and she thought with a kind of quiet astonishment that she was not afraid right now. She was not guarding anything. She was standing in a field she had fixed with a man she trusted, and she was not afraid. And that was, for Maggie Mercer, something so close to extraordinary that it took her breath gently away. She reached out and took his hand. She did it deliberately, the way she did everything deliberately. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face, and his expression was very quiet and very careful and entirely without performance. "I think," she said, "I'm ready to call this something." He turned his hand in hers, holding it properly. "What would you like to call it?" "I don't know exactly," she said, "but I know I don't want it to stop." "Then it won't stop," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was a simple, certain statement from a man who meant everything he said, because he didn't say much he didn't mean. And it was, for that reason, more reliable than any grand declaration she had ever been offered. December brought more cold, and Elias Mercer's condition worsened measurably. The doctor from San Antonio, a careful man named Dr. Hendricks who rode out to Dusty Creek 4 times a year, came in the 2nd week of December and spent 2 hours with Elias, and then sat with Maggie in the kitchen and told her, with professional gentleness, that they were likely looking at weeks rather than months. Maggie received this information with the same straight-spined clarity with which she received all difficult information. She thanked Dr. Hendricks. She walked him to his horse. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment alone, and then she went to her father's room. Elias was sitting up in bed looking at the window with the expression of a man who is making peace with his accounts. "I heard," he said, without turning. She sat in the chair beside his bed. She took his hand. His hands were still large and hard-worked, even now, and they had always seemed to her like the most honest thing about him. "I'm not afraid of it," Elias said. "I want you to know that. The only thing I'm afraid of is leaving you alone with this." "I'm not alone," she said. Elias looked at her. "Walker," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good." It was a single word with the weight of a long man's approval and relief and love packed into it, and Maggie felt it as all of those things simultaneously. "He's a solid man," Elias said. "Not showy, solid. You can build on solid." He paused. Your mother would have liked him. She always liked the quiet ones. You're not quiet, Maggie said. No, Elias agreed. I am not. That was her greatest challenge. He squeezed her hand. Don't wait too long, Maggie, not because you need him, because you want him. That's a better reason for everything. She carried that conversation with her for the rest of December. On Christmas Eve, which was a clear, cold night with frost on every surface, and the stars so sharp and dense they looked like they'd been scattered by a careless hand, Abel Walker came to the Mercer ranch for supper. He brought a small carved wooden box he had made himself, which had taken him 3 weeks of evenings, and inside it was a small piece of paper on which he had written something. He gave it to Maggie without ceremony in the kitchen, while Ernesto and Elias were talking by the fire in the front room. She opened it. It said, I would like to know what you want for your life, fully and completely, and then I would like to spend my life helping you build it. If you want that too, I am asking. If you don't, this still stands as the truest thing I know how to say. She read it twice. She folded it very carefully and held it for a moment. Then she looked at him. That's not quite a proposal, she said. No, he said. I didn't want it to be. A proposal is a man asking for something. This is me telling you something, and leaving the asking to you. She stood with the folded paper in her hand and the frost outside, and the fire's warmth reaching them from the next room and the smell of the supper she'd been cooking all afternoon. What do I want? She said, and it was not quite a question to him. It was more like she was answering the one he had asked her 3 months ago in the autumn sunlight, with the full and complete answer now finally available to her. I want the land and the work and the choices. I want a partner who listens and thinks and doesn't pretend the hard things aren't hard. I want to not be afraid. She looked at him directly. I want you. He did not say I told you so. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, Then you have me. She crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and it was not the tentative, uncertain kiss of people who don't know yet. It was the clear and certain kiss of 2 people who have known for a while and have finally stopped being careful about it. From the front room, Elias Mercer made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been a laugh, and Ernesto said something in Spanish that, if you spoke Spanish, translated roughly as finally. They were married on a Saturday in February of 1880, in the small Methodist church on the main street of Dusty Creek, with Reverend Moore officiating, and about 60 people attending, because Dusty Creek had not had particularly good news for a while, and was glad of it. Dottie Marsh cried, which was noted by everyone because Dottie Marsh was not known for crying. Ernesto stood with the dignity of a man who feels he has had a hand in making something good happen. Silas Prout was not present, having been transferred to a posting in Amarillo some weeks prior, which most people agreed was a mercy for everyone. Elias Mercer sat in a chair at the front of the church, brought in from his bedroom specifically for the occasion, dressed in the good suit he hadn't worn in years. He watched his daughter walk to the altar with the expression of a man who has received, at the end of things, exactly the kind of grace that he had not been sure he deserved. Maggie wore her mother's dress, which had been in a cedar chest for 15 years and required only minor alteration because Clara Mercer and Maggie Mercer had been built along similar lines, as if the world had known what it was going to need. She walked with her chin up and her eyes forward, and she did not look nervous because she was not nervous. Abel stood at the altar in his good coat with his hair actually cut for the occasion, and his gray eyes on her from the moment she appeared in the doorway. And the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who knows he is exactly where he should be and is not going to pretend otherwise. Reverend Moore read the service, and when he reached the vows, Maggie and Abel had written their own, which was not the standard practice and caused Reverend Moore a brief moment of theological uncertainty that he resolved by deciding that love was love and moving forward. Maggie said, I promise to choose you. Every day with full knowledge of who you are and who I am, I choose you. Abel said, I promise to keep asking you what you want and to listen when you tell me. There was a silence in the church that was not emptiness but the opposite of emptiness. Then Reverend Moore said they were married, and they were. Elias Mercer died on a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks after the wedding. He died in his own room in the house he had built, with his hands still on the quilt Clara had made, which had been on that bed since she put it there, and with Maggie beside him. It was peaceful. It was the death of a man who had finished what he came to do and was ready. Maggie grieved clearly and directly, the way she did everything, and she let herself do it. She did not present a managed face to the world. She cried at the funeral, and she cried in the kitchen for several evenings, and she talked about her father to Abel at great length, all of it, the hard parts and the good parts and the parts she was still sorting out. And Abel listened to all of it with the full and present attention that was, she had come to understand, his most profound way of loving her. She did not lose herself. She grieved and she held herself and she was held, and on the other side of it she was still Maggie, still whole, still the woman who had chosen this life with these hands and this mind, and the choosing had not diminished her. It had made her larger. She moved the operation of the Mercer Ranch and the Walker Ranch forward with the kind of practical efficiency that comes from two people who have complementary strengths and genuine respect for each other's judgment. The Mercer land folded into their operation, 140 acres added to Abel's base, which made them together one of the more substantial cattle operations in the eastern part of Calhoun County. They hired Ernesto on properly, with wages that reflected his actual value rather than what the going rate was, and they hired 2 more hands through the spring, and by summer they had a functioning, healthy enterprise that was doing something Elias Mercer would have recognized as the real work of building something worth building. Spring on the Texas frontier was a complicated thing. It arrived with wildflowers and warm rain, and also with every problem that had been frozen in place during winter, the fences that had heaved with the frost, the water sources that had shifted, the cattle that had come through winter lean and needed watching. There was no rest in spring, just the exchange of one kind of work for another kind. One morning in April, Maggie came out to the barn where Abel was treating a cow with a foot problem, and she leaned against the stall door and watched him work for a minute before she said, "I think I'm going to have a baby." He looked up from the cow's foot. He held very still for a moment in the way he held still when something important was happening, and he wanted to receive it completely. Then he straightened up and crossed the barn to her and took her face in his hands with the same care he used for the things he most valued, and he said, "How do you feel?" "Terrified," she said honestly, "and happy at the same time." "That seems right," he said. She laughed, and it was the startled, genuine laugh that had been among the first things she'd given him that surprised her by being given. "You don't tell me not to be terrified." "Why would I do that?" he said. "It's a real thing to feel. You're going to grow a whole person. That's terrifying." He was smiling. "And wonderful." She leaned into him, which she had been doing for months and which still gave her a specific kind of satisfaction, the kind that comes from leaning and finding something genuinely solid. He put his arms around her. "We'll need to think about the back room," she said, already practical, her mind already running toward logistics the way it always did. "It'll need to be cleared and made over." "We have time," he said. "Not as much as you'd think." He laughed, and it was the warm, quiet laugh that she had come to know as one of the things she was most glad to have in the world. "We have enough," he said. The summer of 1880 was full. Maggie ran the ranch with the force of a woman who has something to prove and also something to protect, which turns out to be a very effective combination for running a cattle operation. She rode until she couldn't comfortably ride, then supervised from the wagon seat. She kept the books and negotiated the contracts for the fall cattle sale herself, which caused minor scandal among the buyers who were not used to sitting across from a pregnant woman and being told what price she would accept, but which caused considerably more money to come home than Abel had managed in previous years, which he acknowledged freely and without any wounded pride at all. "You're better at negotiating than I am," he said, when she came home from the September sale with the contracts in hand and the numbers she'd wanted. "You're too honest in your face," she told him. "They can see your bottom line. Whereas you look like you could walk away at any moment." "I could," she said. "That's the difference." He looked at her with the fond, clear-eyed regard that she had come to understand was his primary way of showing love, this looking at her that was really seeing her, and she felt it the way she always felt it, like warmth in the specific places you didn't know were cold. Their son was born in October of 1880. He arrived on a Thursday morning after a labor that Maggie managed with the same grim competence with which she managed all difficult things, and the midwife, Mrs. Farrow, who had delivered half the children in Calhoun County, said afterward that Maggie Mercer was the most controlled woman she had ever attended, which was meant as a compliment and was received as one. The baby was healthy and strong-lunged, and had Abel's gray eyes and Maggie's direct expression, which was a remarkable combination to see on a face that was 3 hours old. Abel held him with the careful, slightly awed attention of a man encountering something new in the world that he has no existing frame for. He sat beside Maggie's bed and held his son and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Well," he finally said. "Yes," Maggie agreed. He seemed to be searching. "Very real." "They tend to be," she said. He looked at her. She was exhausted in a way that had stripped her face down to something even more essential than usual, and she was looking at him holding their son with an expression that, if she had been asked to name it, she probably could not have, because it was too large for a name. It was the specific expression of a woman who was wholly herself and wholly loved and entirely unafraid. They named him Elias James Walker. Elias for her father, James for her brother. Abel had suggested this without being asked, and Maggie had looked at him when he said it with an expression he recognized as the one that meant she was feeling something large and was choosing not to perform it, which was its own kind of declaration. Little Elias was a calm baby, which surprised everyone who knew his parents, who were both calm themselves, but in ways that suggested capacity for considerable intensity. He observed the world from very early with the gray-eyed, considering expression of a boy who is collecting information before committing to any conclusions. Abel and Maggie raised him in the specific way of people who have thought about what they actually believe about children, which was that you tell them the truth, you answer their questions, you don't pretend the hard things aren't hard, and you give them enough room to figure out who they are while keeping them close enough to stay safe. This turned out to produce a thoughtful, curious child who was easy to underestimate and should not have been. The ranch grew. By 1882, they had added another 40 acres of grazing land by purchasing the adjacent property when the Harrington family moved north, and their cattle operation had expanded to something that required real management rather than just industrious daily effort. Abel had the instinct for animals and land. Maggie had the instinct for the business of it, the numbers and the contracts and the strategic thinking about what the market was going to do and when to sell and when to hold. Together they were considerably more than the sum of their parts, and they knew it, and they were grateful for it without being smug about it. They had disagreements, real ones about real things. About the decision to invest in a new bull that Maggie thought was necessary, and Abel thought was premature given the water situation on the north pasture. About the way to handle a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Cobb who was consistently running his cattle over their fence line. About whether to take on a third hired hand or manage without one for another season. The disagreements were notable because they did not become something else. They did not become battles about power or precedence or who was in charge. They were what they appeared to be, two people who respected each other's intelligence and disagreed about specific things and worked through it. Sometimes Maggie was right and Abel acknowledged it. Sometimes Abel was right and Maggie acknowledged it. Sometimes they were both partially right and the answer was in the middle. Do you know what's unusual about us? Maggie said one evening in the summer of 1882, sitting on the porch after Elias was asleep and the heat of the day was finally releasing. Many things, probably, Abel said. We argue and then we stop, she said. We just stop. When one of us has the better reasoning, the other one stops. That seems like how it should work, he said. It isn't how it works for most people, she said. Most people argue until someone's feelings are settled, not until the truth is settled. He considered that. I don't see the point of winning if you're wrong, he said. Most people do, though, she said. The winning feels like the point. He looked at her in the evening light. Does it ever feel like that to you? She thought about it honestly. Sometimes, she said, when I'm tired and my pride is involved. But then I remember that I married someone with better judgment than pride and I recalibrate. He shook his head, smiling. You have better judgment than pride too. Not always, she said. But I'm working on it. He reached over and took her hand on the porch rail, the way they did in the evenings, the easy, habitual touch of people who have learned each other's hands and find comfort in the specific weight and warmth. You're the best person I know, he said. It came out simple and straightforward, the way he said everything that he really meant. She looked at him. The summer stars were beginning to appear. Little Elias was inside making the small, settled sounds of a child who has decided to be asleep. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. The dog, old Hector, was asleep on the porch steps. I used to think, she said, that loving someone was something that happened to you, like weather. Like you had no agency in it. And now I think it's something you do, she said. Every day you choose it, you practice it. It gets easier and better and more itself the longer you do it. She looked at his hand in hers. Like anything worth doing, he squeezed her hand. You should write that down, he said. Someone should hear it. I'm telling you, she said, that's enough. By the fall of 1883, Maggie was pregnant again, which she had suspected, and had confirmed by the doctor with the specific satisfaction of a woman whose planning and reality are in alignment. This pregnancy was different from the first, not harder exactly, but fuller in the way that second pregnancies are fuller, because you know what you're doing and what's coming, and the knowledge removes the anxiety but adds a different kind of feeling, the feeling of something you love arriving again in a form that will be entirely new. Ernesto, by this point, had become what he had always been quietly working toward being, which was the third essential presence on the Walker Ranch, the steady and unassuming backbone of the daily operation. His own family, his wife Carmen and their 3 children, lived in the small house that Abel and Maggie had built on the southern edge of the property, and Carmen had become, over time, the closest thing Maggie had to a sister, which was not a small thing and was not treated as one. Carmen Vila was a formidable woman who had grown up in a Texas that treated people of Mexican heritage as something between inconvenient and invisible, and who had navigated this with the combination of dignity and pragmatism that necessity builds. She and Maggie had a friendship based on mutual respect and absolute honesty, and a shared and frequently exercised sense of humor about the absurdity of the world, which turned out to be one of the best foundations for friendship available. When Maggie told Carmen she was expecting again, Carmen put her hands on her own hips and said, in the direct way she had, boy or girl this time, what do you want? Maggie thought about it. I want whoever shows up, she said, healthy and loud. Good answer, Carmen said. That's always the right answer. The baby was born in April of 1884, and she was a girl, which Maggie and Abel both received with uncomplicated joy. She was not a calm baby. She was a loud, opinionated, hungry, bright-eyed baby who seemed to arrive already certain that she had things to accomplish and was not interested in waiting. Little Elias, 3½ regarded her with the grave interest of an older sibling processing a significant new variable. They named her Clara Ruth Walker, Clara for Maggie's mother, Ruth for Abel's mother. Abel held Clara Ruth for the first time and said, with the quiet wonder that he brought to things that moved him deeply, she looks like she already knows something we don't. She probably does, Maggie said. I suspect she's going to spend the next 20 years proving it." He looked at his daughter, and then at his wife with the expression that Maggie had learned to read as the most complete version of what he felt, which was a kind of gratitude so specific and large that it didn't have a common word for it. It was the feeling of a man who has looked at his life and found it to be, in all its imperfect and complicated reality, exactly what he would have chosen. "Are you happy?" Maggie asked him, because she asked him this with some regularity, as she asked herself the same question, because she believed it was a question you had to keep asking to make sure you were still answering it honestly. "Yes," he said without hesitation, which was how he said things he had already fully thought through. "So am I," she said. And she was. This was the thing that had taken her 26 years and a quiet rancher with gray eyes and the specific capacity to ask the right question to understand. Happiness was not the absence of difficulty or the resolution of all problems. It was not the arrival at some perfect static state. It was a thing that moved and changed and needed tending, like the land, like the cattle, like anything alive. It was built from small moments and honest words and the daily choice to be present to your own life and to the people in it. She had built it piece by piece, with full knowledge and full intention, and it was real in a way that nothing given to her would have been. The winter of 1884 brought a serious challenge to the county. A drought that had been building for 2 seasons came fully into its own, and the grass dried and the water sources dropped, and several smaller ranching operations found themselves in genuine crisis. The Walker operation weathered it better than most because Abel had been conservative about expansion during the good years, and had built a water storage system on the property that was not elegant but was functional, and because Maggie had diversified their income sources in ways that included a small but reliable beef contract with the Army post 30 miles northwest that kept revenue coming in regardless of market fluctuations. But weathering something well does not mean weathering it without cost, and the winter was hard and the work was constant and relentless, and both of them were tired in the bone-deep way of people who carry real weight every single day. One February evening, Abel came in from a very long day of cold and difficult work and sat at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands for a moment, not performing exhaustion, just feeling it, and Maggie put down what she was doing and brought him hot coffee and sat across from him and waited. He lifted his face. He looked at her. "Lost 2 cows today," he said. "I know," she said. "Ernesto told me." He wrapped his hands around the coffee. "I've been going over the numbers." "So have I," she said. "We're all right. It's hard, but we're all right." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Stay clear," he said. "When everything is pressing in, you stay clear." She thought about it. "I think," she said, "I learned it from watching my father lose his clarity to grief and seeing what that cost him. I decided very young that I was going to know always exactly where I was standing." She paused. "And I think it's easier now with you, because I'm not spending any energy on anything hidden. I'm not managing your perception of me or protecting myself from you. I can just—" She made a small gesture. "Think." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you said about love being something you do, not something that happens to you?" "Yes. I think that's the most important thing I've ever heard," he said. She smiled. It was the smile that had started as a surprised laugh in a corral in October of 1879 and had developed in the years since into one of the warmest and most genuine expressions she was capable of. "You've read a great deal," she said. "I'm sure you've heard more important things." "More complicated things," he said, "not more important ones." They sat in the warm kitchen with the cold outside pressing at the walls and the 2 children asleep in their rooms and the old dog sighing in his corner. And the completeness of what they had built together was palpable in the room, present as a third person, earned and specific and deeply, entirely real. Spring came back as it always does, not dramatically, but incrementally, degrees of warmth and color accumulating, until the day you look up and realize that it has arrived. The drought broke in March of 1885 with a series of steady rains that felt, to the cattle ranchers of Calhoun County, like a reprieve from a sentence they hadn't been sure they would survive. The grass came back greener than it had been in 2 seasons, and the cattle recovered condition, and the Walker operation moved into its full spring work with the energy of people who have come through something hard and are grateful for the straightforward difficulty of ordinary work. Elias, 5 now, was old enough to follow Abel around the ranch in serious imitation of whatever his father was doing, which Abel encouraged with patience and also with the particular seriousness of a man who believes that real work deserves to be taught properly. He showed Elias how to check the cattle, how to read the grass, how to handle a horse. He answered questions fully, without condescension, which produced a child who asked excellent questions because he had learned that they would be answered honestly. Clara Ruth, 14 months, had opinions about everything and the volume to express them, and the physical determination to get wherever she wanted to go with or without assistance. She and Maggie had a relationship of mutual recognition, 2 people of strong will in constant negotiation, which was both demanding and quietly hilarious to observe. One afternoon in May, Maggie found Abel sitting with Clara Ruth on the porch steps while the baby examined a beetle with the concentration of a small scientist. He was watching the child with the expression she had come to associate with his deepest contentment, this stillness that was not absence but presence. She sat beside him. He put his arm around her. Clara Ruth looked up briefly to check that both parents were accounted for, satisfied herself on this point, and returned to the beetle. "What are you thinking?" Maggie asked. "That this is it," he said. "This specific moment, this is the thing. The thing. The thing people are actually trying to get to," he said. "All the working and building and planning, it's for this, the being here, he gestured at the porch and the child and the afternoon, all of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He smelled of horses and hay and the specific warmth of a man who has been working outside and come into the sun to rest, and she breathed it in with the gratitude of someone who has learned to receive what is good without immediately worrying about its loss. "I thought it was going to feel like giving something up," she said. "Loving me," he said. "Loving anyone," she said. "I thought it would feel like diminishment, like I would be less." He was quiet. "It feels like the opposite," she said. I'm more of what I was before, like it expanded instead of contracted." She looked at Clara Ruth and the beetle. "I think my father got it wrong," she said softly. "Not wrong to love my mother, wrong to let the love be everything, wrong to not keep building himself at the same time. So when she went, there was nothing underneath." "And you built the underneath first," he said. "We built it together," she corrected. "That's the thing I couldn't have done alone, not in the way it needed to be built." He held her a little tighter. The afternoon light was the specific golden light of Texas in May that hits things from the side and makes everything look both more ordinary and more itself. The cattle were distant and visible in the north pasture. Hector, elderly and stiff, was sleeping in the patch of sun by the door. Elia's voice came from the barn, asking Ernesto something with great seriousness. The world was real and present and entirely, stubbornly, wonderfully alive. In September of 1885, something happened that tested them in a way that all the drought and work and difficulty had not quite managed to. Silas Prout came back to Dusty Creek. He had been posted back as deputy marshal, the original one having retired, and he arrived on a Tuesday with a new horse and the same confident bearing, and apparently the same unresolved feelings about his rejection 5 years prior. He made this known not through any direct action, but through the specific, accumulated small actions of a man who wants to demonstrate that he has not forgotten, and has not forgiven, and believes that time has settled things in his favor. He was formal with Abel in ways that were technically correct and substantively disrespectful. He made comments in the saloon, which got back to Maggie the way everything in Dusty Creek got back to everyone, that implied that Walker had built his operation on Mercer land that should by rights have gone to a more substantial man. He alluded, in the way of a man who wants to wound without being confronted directly, to Maggie's previous refusals of more prominent suitors, as though the marriage to a quiet rancher was the inevitable settling of an unrealistic woman. Maggie heard all of this. She processed it. She made a decision about it. She went to Silas Pruitt's office on a Wednesday morning, and she sat down across from his desk, and she looked at him with the full, direct weight of her regard, which had not diminished in 5 years, and if anything had been augmented by confidence and certainty and the knowledge of exactly who she was. "Silas," she said. "Mrs. Walker," he said, with the precise formality of a man who hopes his formality reads as indifference. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Not because you're owed it, but because I believe in saying true things clearly." She held his gaze. "I didn't reject you because of your standing or your ambition or anything about your visible qualities. I rejected you because you didn't see me. You saw a situation. You saw property and practicality and a woman who was a piece of your plan." She paused. Abel Walker walked into a store and said one sentence that proved he saw the person. "That is the whole of it. There's no hidden story and no secret bitterness and no lesson in it that reflects on your worth as a man. It reflects on fit. And we didn't fit." Pruitt sat across from her with a jaw that was working and eyes that were not quite meeting hers. "I'm saying this," she said, "because I would like you to stop, not aggressively, just clearly. The comments and the implications, stop. We live in the same town and we will continue to. It doesn't need to be this." There was a long silence. Then Silas Pruitt did something that Maggie had not quite expected. He looked at the desk and then at the window and then at her, and some of the stiffness went out of him, the way stiffness goes when a person stops performing for an audience that isn't there. "You're right," he said. "It was a long time ago and I've been behaving badly about it." He paused. "I'll stop." She stood. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. She told Abel about the conversation that evening, and he listened to all of it and then said, "That was brave." "It wasn't," she said. "It was just the right thing to do." "Those are often the same thing," he said. She looked at him. "Did it bother you what he was saying?" "Some," he admitted. "Mostly because it was about you, not me. I don't particularly care what people think about my choices, but when someone implies something diminishing about you." He stopped. "Yes, it bothered me." "But you didn't do anything about it," she said. "You didn't need me to," he said. "And it wasn't my conversation to have." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him in the specific, considered way that she kissed him when she wanted him to know she was seeing him clearly, and what she saw was exactly right. He held her face in his hands and kissed her back with the same care and the same intention, and they stood in their kitchen in the September evening and were entirely, completely themselves together. Silas Pruitt kept his word. He was civil. He eventually, over the following year, developed a respect for Abel Walker that was grudging and then genuine, the way respect sometimes arrives when you stop looking for reasons to withhold it. He was transferred again 2 years later to a posting in New Mexico Territory, and Dusty Creek moved on as small towns always do, forward, incrementally, carrying its stories in the same way it carried everything else, necessary and unremarked. The years moved the way good years do, which is quickly when you look back and slowly when you're in them. Little Elias grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who was good with animals in the specific way of his father, intuitive and patient, and who read every book that could be gotten to Dusty Creek through Hector Crane's ordering service, which was a remarkable number of books given the effort involved. By the time he was 8, he was reading things that had Maggie asking Abel whether he'd actually read this one yet, which began a family habit of passing books around and discussing them that became one of the great pleasures of their household. Clara Ruth grew into a child who was exactly the force of nature Maggie had predicted from the first week of her life. She was loud and bold and decided, and she had a gift for animals that was different from Elias' quieter way. Hers was a commanding kind of gift. Animals responded to her because she expected them to, and communicated that expectation with remarkable clarity. She also had her grandmother Clara's warmth, the warmth that had been so evident in Maggie's early memories of her mother, and it made her combination of force and warmth into something that was very nearly charismatic in a 7-year-old. In the spring of 1888, Maggie discovered she was expecting a third time, which surprised her somewhat, and then didn't, and which she told Abel about on the porch one morning before the children were awake, in the soft gray light before sunrise. He received this with the same wonder he had brought to the first 2 times, which she found remarkable and said so. "It's remarkable every time," he said simply. Why would the wonder go away? She had no answer for that. She leaned against him and watched the sky go from gray to pink to the first clear blue of morning. The third child was another boy, born in December of 1888, right at the turn of the year. They named him William Abel Walker, William for Abel's father, Abel for himself, because Maggie insisted on it, and Abel resisted on the grounds that it seemed immodest. And Maggie said that was precisely the reason she was insisting, because he was the most necessary person in her life, and it was going to be acknowledged whether he was comfortable with it or not. William was a combination of both his siblings. He had Elia's thoughtfulness and Clara Ruth's volume, which was a challenging but very entertaining combination. He arrived in the world yelling and considering simultaneously, and did not particularly change this approach over the years that followed. By 1890, the Walker Ranch was one of the most stable and respected operations in Calhoun County. It was not the largest. Abel had never wanted the largest. He wanted the most functional, the most honest, the operation that was doing exactly what it was supposed to do as well as it could be done. They had 90 head of cattle, a reputation for honest dealing that brought buyers back year after year, and a household that was busy and purposeful and full of the specific noise of 3 children who had been raised to have opinions and express them. Ernesto and Carmen and their own growing family were as much a part of the operation as anyone, and the understanding between the 2 families went far beyond employer and employee into something that reflected what was actually true, which was that they had built something together, and the building was shared even when the formal ownership wasn't, and they dealt with each other with the respect and honesty that this truth deserved. Maggie kept the books and the contracts and the strategic planning of the operation, and also raised 3 children, and also maintained the kind of household that was a real home, rather than just a structure people slept in. And she did all of these things not with the tight-jawed determination of someone proving a point, but with the broad-shouldered ease of someone doing what they are genuinely good at and generally enjoy. She was 41 in 1895, and she was, in the specific and unperformative way of a woman who has had the time and the safety to figure it out, entirely herself. She was harder-edged in some places than she had been at 26 and softer in others, and both of these things were improvements on the original, which had been excellent but unfinished. One evening in September of that year, she and Abel sat on the porch after supper, as they did in good weather and frequently in bad weather too, while the 3 children were at various stages of their evening routines inside. Elia's 15 was reading. Clara Ruth, 11, was arguing with William about something with the vigor she brought to all her positions. William, 6, was being loudly wrong about whatever it was with equal commitment. "Pruda's getting married," Abel said, reading the newspaper that came from San Antonio 3 days late. "Is he?" Maggie said. "Good, who to?" "Says a woman from Albuquerque," Abel said. "A widow teacher." "That sounds right," Maggie said. "He would do well with someone who could stand up to him." He set the paper down. The evening light was warm and slant. The cattle were quiet. Old Hector had been gone for 2 years, and there was a new dog, also named Hector, who was young and extravagantly energetic and was currently chasing something through the far field. "Are you glad?" Abel asked. "That it all worked out the way it did?" She looked at him. "I've been glad every day," she said. "Sometimes more consciously than other days. Even the hard days, especially those," she said. "The hard days are when I know it's real, Easy things could be anything. Hard things show you what you actually have." He smiled. It was the slow smile that still arrived at its destination at exactly the right pace and that she had loved for 15 years. "What do you have?" he said. It was not quite a fishing question. It was the question of someone who genuinely wants to hear the answer said out loud. She looked at the field and the sky and the house and at him. "Everything I wanted," she said, "and some things I didn't know to want, which are the best parts." He reached over and took her hand on the porch rail. She turned her hand and held his back. The children's voices inside rose and settled and rose again. Young Hector came bounding back from the field with something in his mouth that turned out to be a stick. The last of the September light burnished everything gold and specific and irreplaceable. "Ask me something," she said, because this had become, over 15 years, one of their ways of being together, the questions that went past the surface of things. He thought for a moment. "If you could tell yourself something," he said. "The version of you standing in Hector Crane's store in 1879 with Prout's ring at her feet. What would you tell her?" She thought about it for a long time, seriously, the way she took the serious questions. "I'd tell her," she said finally, "that being whole and being loved are not opposites. I'd tell her that the right person doesn't take pieces of you. The right person shows you pieces you didn't know you had." She looked at their joined hands. "And I'd tell her that a man who asks what you want instead of telling you what he's offering is worth paying attention to." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had been seeing her clearly for 15 years. "That's good advice," he said. "It came from experience," she said. The last of the light went from gold to rose to the beginning of dark, and the stars began in the east the way they always did, one at a time and then all at once, that enormous Texas sky making good on its perpetual extravagant promise. Inside, Clara Ruth's argument with William reached some resolution that satisfied both of them, because the volume dropped. Elias said something, his voice low and measured, the voice that had been deepening for 2 years and still surprised Maggie every time with its resemblance to Abel's. Young Hector circled the porch 3 times and settled on the steps. Abel Walker sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his, and looked at the life they had built together, which was real and specific and fully known to him in all its dimensions, the good and the hard and the ordinary and the extraordinary, the cattle and the children and the land and the woman beside him who had walked into a corral in October of 1879 and asked him if he'd meant what he said, and had been asking him real questions ever since. He thought about the sentence he had said in Hector Crane's store on that September afternoon in 1879, the thing that had arrived fully formed and without planning, the observation that nobody was asking the right question. He had not known when he said it that it would change everything. He had simply known that it was true and that true things were worth saying. He knew it more completely now than he had then. "What do you want?" he asked her, because he still asked her, because she had told him once that this was the most important promise he had made, not the formal ones at the altar, but this one, the quiet daily one, the asking. She looked at him and smiled, and the smile was the whole of it. The years and the children and the land and the work and the grief they had carried and the joy they had built and the particular, specific, irreplaceable truth of knowing someone completely. "This," she said. "Exactly this." And in the gathering dark of a September evening in 1895 on the eastern edge of Calhoun County, Texas, with the cattle settling and the children inside, and the stars coming up one by one, Abel Walker and Maggie Mercer sat on their porch and held each other's hands and were exactly, completely, entirely where they had chosen to be. Which was, of all the places in the world they might have been, the one that was most fully home.